have stopped here before, but Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park does actually own a 50-foot by 50-foot piece of property here. When the state of New York decided to erect monuments for their troops' involvement in the siege and battles for Chattanooga, they bought several small parcels of property over here, and this is one of them. And on it was erected the monument to Green's brigade of Gary's division, or at least those elements of the brigade that were actually here. The troops were bivouacked in this area, along some in the cornfield, some right along here into the south. The road, farm buildings were somewhere just right out here in front of us, and when the Confederates attack, Gary is going to deploy his troops perpendicular to the Waxahachie Pike and running westward and facing to the north. So we'd be just a little bit behind the line right here. Although, as I said, this hill was once considerably taller, flattened for what used to be a truck company headquarters and that trailer parking lot. And Gary's 4 guns were put up on the top of that hill. The Nashville and Chattanooga Railroad embankment is much greater today than it was at the time, but it's going to be used by the Federals first as a fighting position, and then some Confederates are going to try to get around the end of it. That's when the 29th Pennsylvania Detachment will take one of Gary's guns, move it by hand down across the railroad to fire up the other side into the flank of those South Carolinians. But as you look now north across the chemical plant, you'd be looking across the cornfield, and the trees just beyond the cornfield are grown up on that wet weather drainage. And so Bratton's men are going to attack from north to south towards us, move through that wet area, and then climb out of those trees and come out into that north end of the field, but not get very far because Gary's fire is going to blow them to a halt and push them back into the trees. When Bratton has to give up the attack and withdraw, Gary is kind of left here all by himself for a time. But the next morning about dawn, relief is going to arrive for Gary. Some of the 11th Corps troops and some of the Army of the Cumberland troops from the Browns Ferry foothold will march down into this area. Gary is not convinced that the Confederates aren't going to try this again. And so almost immediately, they begin to build some fortifications to deal with a potential Confederate attack. Where are the Confederates now? Just over on Lookout Mountain. They orient the works more towards the mountain, and the men begin going to work to construct the field fortifications. They need material. Guess what's right nearby? The house. What had Mrs. Roden said the night before? They're going to be attacked. Guess what is one of the principal sources of construction material for a section of the field fortifications? They tore down the house and put the shingles, rafters, logs, furniture, clothes, and everything into the works. And one of the things that makes putting this battle hard on the ground is the principal landmark for the Union troops about where they were is all relative to the Roden cabin. Guess what disappeared shortly after dawn on October the 29th? The Roden cabin. And as a result, it's a little hard to be real precise about one of the points that is not really recognized probably enough is that there was a route, probably really no more than a farm lane, which ran west from here. That road ran westward and towards the notch or gap in the Sand Mountain Range, which leads out to Kelly's Ferry. What are they trying to do? Clear the north end of the valley and then be able to bring supplies up the river to Kelly's Ferry. So they are really oriented on protecting the valley up in this area. And in fact, they are going to pull back from this position a couple of days later and deploy on the tops of some of the hills back there where they really are only guarding the exit from the gap leading from Kelly's Ferry, and the wagons are then going to move across the north end of the valley up to Brown's Ferry. This is kind of no man's land in November, leading up to the Battle of Lookout Mountain. The Federals are picketing Lookout Creek, but their main line is back there. The picket line is there. This is kind of out between, or out in the area between the main line and the picket lines. And actually, not a lot of Federal movement until Sherman arrives in November. Not a lot of Federal movement seems to come through the valley here. Most of it is all oriented on coming through Kelly's Ferries. Questions or observations? Dave, anything you want to ask?
I want to see this.
Okay. Anthony, anything?
No. Found a few canister rifle parts down in there. That's about all.
Did you get to hunt it before the chemical plant? Some of the old guys talk about finding a lot of...
They're really old, too.
Yeah, right. Because that thing's been there forever and ever and ever. So. No, there isn't that I can find or know of because of all this industrial development back here. There is another road, a modern road down here, which actually does something similar, going out that way. Back there, just on this side of the gap, was the large Cummings farm. And I'll try to point that out in just a little bit.
It's interesting. Pulling back is exactly the time, because then he can control this from there.
Gary spanned the next morning after dawn, as the situation here is found to have been stabilized. They go out in front. So hasty was Bratton's withdrawal. There are a couple of dozen wounded Confederate soldiers laying out there, and just over 150 dead South Carolinians. And some of these soldiers, both of Gary's division and some of the Army of the Cumberland troops who marched down here, are tasked with burying them. Not at all happy with what they have just experienced. Guess what they did with the South Carolinians' bodies? Where's the natural grave? The wet weather drainage. They pushed them down into the drainage, covered them with a little bit of dirt. And that's the last reference to where the South Carolinians are. There is no indication that the Ladies Memorial Association from Marietta came to this battlefield to get any Confederate dead in the late 1860s, and I suspect they probably mouldered away in that wet ground, and the periodic flooding of that wet ground probably washed their remains downstream. Morning of the 29th, and the burial of those guys is the last time I've ever seen any reference to what happened to the Confederate dead. You haven't seen any names. I suspect they probably, just in pieces, eventually got washed down into Lookout Creek and down the Tennessee rivers. Gary's men are not at all happy, and Gary himself is, of course, sad, angry, depressed, upset, vengeful, because his son, having just finished sighting one of the 10-pounder parrots of Knapp's battery, rises up, step back and order the gun to fire, and he's struck over one of the eyes and killed instantly. And there he is. And is now.
I'm from Pennsylvania. He's buried in the graveyard of my church. So if anyone wants a picture of the tombstone or something, see me. I can take one and email you. Delmont Presbyterian Church, Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania. And it was called Salem Crossroads in those days.
And there are a couple of great letters from Gary back to his second wife. Edward was a child of his first wife, but Gary writes back to his second wife, and he's swearing vengeance against the Confederates the next time he gets a chance at us. And Gary was not a man to take lightly. He was a larger individual for his time, and as a result, largely as a result of that and his personality, he had been territorial governor of Kansas for a time, and did much to suppress the Bleeding Kansas violence. But like almost all of the territorial governors of Kansas, they had their problems and had their fill of it, there are, I don't know what, 4 or 5 of those guys in a relatively short time period. Gary's one of those. Okay, let's let me signal.
They're the preserve brigades that never comes down on the hill. Except July 1.
Now, Smith Hill is one of the most complex geographic features we deal with here with this campaign. There is this range of hills running along the riverbank here, that same range of hills that we saw that Browns Ferry goes through. Well, you come down from those hills right up to Browns Ferry that we saw before lunch. There is a larger notch or gap right over here where the Browns Ferry Marina and condominiums and subdivision are located today, which is often a point of confusion in this story because that is called Browns Ferry Marina and condominiums today. But then, south of that, the range of hills picks up again, and this is all generally known as Smith Hill. Smith Hill goes through that single ridge line, or ridge that we saw up there at Browns Ferry. Here near the southern end of it, it is going to split. It's actually going to become kind of a V. I'll do it this way. Here's the range of hills. Browns Ferry would be up here. The big notch, one right over there, be along in here. But as it goes back to the south, as it approaches the end, it kind of splits or V's like this. Today, the interstate highway cuts through the southern portion of both of those arms of the V, which only creates seemingly more hills, because technically it does. Which also makes it really hard to tell people, where is this thing called Smith's Hill. Well, it gets its name because on these hilltops is where the Confederate blocking force was located. And Robertson's Texas Brigade was up on that hill, and Law's Alabama Brigade is up on the part of it down there, and stretching on southward. Well, their mission is to prevent 11th Corps troops and Army of the Cumberland troops up there from coming south into the rear of Bratton as Bratton attacks Gary. Well, the main lines are on the tops of the hills. They've got their skirmishers out, but they don't actually sit astride, as David noted, they don't sit astride the Browns Ferry Road right here. So now, all of a sudden, the assembly is sounded, the long roll is beat because of the fire going on down at Waxahachie. The 11th Corps troops begin to march south. And as they come along, they are going to encounter the Confederate pickets who are out here in front of this position.
One of the things I wanted to mention is the 11th Corps actually gets a later start than it should have. And so this happens more like 2 o'clock in the morning as opposed to midnight. And that goes back to this problem we have between Hooker and Schurz and the 11th Corps troops. Once Hooker becomes aware that Gary is in trouble, once he hears the firing down there, General Hooker seems to go into a little bit of a panic. And he orders, the order of camp is the 2nd Division is furthest north, and then Schurz's 3rd Division of the 11th Corps is closest to where we are now. But this isn't called Schurz's Hill because General Hooker calls Schurz to his camp first to confer with him, sends orders for him to get his men moving south, then calls him forward. So Schurz's troops don't actually start the movement south. The 2nd Division, Corporal Smith's Brigade and Hector Tyndale, they start south and actually move through 3rd Division, 11th Corps, and so they're leading this column, and that's how come they get involved here, and Schurz doesn't. But this movement probably delays the 11th Corps for at least an hour, probably more at night. So all this time while Gary is fighting, he can't get any help, and it's because Schurz and Hooker are having this issue of communication where, to quote Peter Cousins, Schurz was not a great military mind, but he didn't have to have the orders given to him 3 times in order to execute it.
So as they're marching south, they run into the Confederate skirmishers and they begin to turn and deploy. And Smith's Brigade is going to go charging up the hill against the Texans. And they're going to be joined by Bushbeck's brigade coming in as well on the flank. Others of these troops are actually going to pass behind this as it is going on. Particularly for the 33rd Massachusetts and the 73rd Ohio, this is one of their notable fights of the war. It occurs in the dark. It occurs going up a really steep hill. And while these Confederates do not fight for long, they do put up some fight for a time, and it's a pretty vicious little fight, and the Confederates are going to cause quite a few casualties.
These 2 regiments soon become aware that there's a lot more Confederates on that hill than they have in their ranks.
And they start working their way up, but as other troops go on further down, run into more of the Confederates begin, in addition to the fact that just there are lots of Federals arriving, the Confederates begin to become very concerned about these the 11th Corps troops moving southward, and the Confederate line begins to collapse in the face of these attacks. And they start to go off the backside of the hill here, and Smith's men, further south, Tyndale's men will get up on the tops of those hills. But with the departure of Robertson and Law, and then Benning down there, it of course forces Bratton to have to give up his attack, but it opens this corridor to allow the 11th Corps troops to go down towards Gary, including some of the Army of the Cumberland detachment. This is the other part of the Battle of Walhatchee, the part that is usually forgotten, this battle between Schurz and Hooker, and these 11th Corps troops against Jenkins, the rest of Jenkins' division up here on this hill. And these Confederates don't really acquit themselves very well. Their withdrawal off the backside of the hill is pretty disorganized. But with their withdrawal, with Bratton's withdrawal, the Confederates are going to withdraw back across Lookout Creek, and they'll be confined to the base, or to Lookout Mountain and along Lookout Creek. Thereafter, the next morning after dawn, Smith in particular realizes that there is the other branch of the hill immediately in his front. There's a deep ravine in between them. He advances down through that up onto the top of the other hill, and we'll dig in and deploy. And we'll be there then for the next month before the attack on Lookout Mountain. But you've got 11th Corps camps out here in the valley here through November and leading up to the Battle of Lookout Mountain. But with the federal victory at Walhatchee, now the north end of Lookout Valley is firmly in Union hands, and supplies can start to be brought up from Bridgeport by steamboat towards Kelly's Ford.
I think this is an interesting action because it to me, it represents a sort of, well, the 11th Corps came here with a bad reputation, and they leave here as part of the Army of the Cumberland with a much better reputation. And I haven't found a great deal of evidence of it, but I believe it's because they do well in this initial encounter, especially after it becomes obvious that they faced a couple of different rebel brigades.
Here's an account from a guy in the 33rd Massachusetts. Before 1 o'clock, we were marching back with orders to carry and hold the ridge at all hazards. Upon their arrival, it was found to be a steep declivity of nearly 200 feet, so thickly wooded, covered with underbrush, as to almost render it impassable. But it must be done before daylight, or the consequences would prove serious. To 33rd Massachusetts and 73rd Ohio were assigned the perilous duty of charging up that steep mountain slope and driving the enemy from the top. How well it was done, the result will prove. At the word forward, the boys took as quick a step as the nature of the ground would permit, and slowly worked their way up the steep side of the ridge, not knowing what might be in store for them upon their arrival at the top. After being fired upon by the Confederates and taking heavy casualties, the regiment fell back to the foot of the hill and quickly formed for the charge. Once more gaining their former position, we were received with a murderous fire over the bank into the pits with the enemy, but was the work of an instant. And at it they went, charging with the bayonet, dealing each other blows over the head with the musket, until the whole scene resembled a grand knockdown, our boys reaching the rifle pits and dragging out the Rebs by the collar. This was too much for them, and they seemed amazed and confused, and finally gave way and started over the opposite side of the hill at a very fast pace. In a short time, we had a formidable line of pits thrown up on the other side of the ridge. And these two units will take a fair number of casualties here. And in Section B of the Chattanooga National Cemetery, you can find a pretty good row of 33rd Massachusetts and 73rd Ohio guys, all with the dates October 29, 1860. Let's see, Anthony, any observations?
He's found a lot of stuff here, mostly though I think
come out here. Of course, some of these guys they've faced before in the East, but after this, they have quite a time, almost kind of enjoying themselves, interacting with a whole new bunch of Confederates, Army of Tennessee guys, and there's a lot of fraternization across Lookout Creek in November. There are a lot of Cedar Gardner canteens that survive today, and a lot of them have 11th and 12th Corps Chattanooga fall 1863 connections, because these 11th and 12th Corps guys don't seem to have seen these cedar drum canteens very much in Virginia, so there are a lot of them sent home.
I've seen a couple of actually seen when the Confederate kicked it across Lookout Creek.
Yeah, carved right into the side of it, and they sent it home as a souvenir. Okay. Now the 11th, 12th Corps people meet one another here, well out to the west. There is some recognition of it in the papers. It doesn't get a great deal of attention.
It gets a little more attention in the post-war period when the veterans start to see a little bit of the irony of it. At the time, you're a soldier, you go where you're sent.
Yeah, and the big thing that you do see at the time is the guying, the jabbing, some of it good-natured, between the Army of the Cumberland troops and the Army of the Potomac troops, and the Army of Tennessee troops and the Army of Northern Virginia troops.
Conflict is centered by side rather than
you see a tremendous amount of comparison, both in the letters and diaries, the post-war accounts, the newspapers of the period. You see a lot of comparisons. An Army of the Cumberland guy will talk about how the paper collar soldiers of the Army of the Potomac had showed up. The Army of the Potomac guys will talk about the rubes of the Army of the Cumberland, who have first contact with men in the 12th, in Gary's division of the 12th Corps. And boy, there were a lot of generals in that formation. They've all got a single white star on. The Corps badge. And then the comparisons that had occurred back in September between how uniformly dressed or uniformly uniformed the Army of Northern Virginia troops were, Longstreet's divisions, versus Bragg's troops. They were uniformed, but less uniformly. Or as one of my reenacting friends says, Colonel Thomas says, they were multi-formed.
Any Army of Tennessee man offered to exchange a Bragg jacket for a Lee jacket. They didn't get many takers.
Other questions or observations?